thank you again for participating in the Cannabis Sustainability Symposium. This is our second year, and once again, we've been very successful. This is also our last session, so savor it. I'm Meg Collins. I am the Vice President of Public Affairs for Good Chemistry Nurseries, where I manage strategic planning and business development, as well as oversee policy development and government affairs. Today's panel is going to be speaking on integrated pest management and testing in cannabis cultivation. Preventing pests and the extensive damage they can do in our cultivations is a major concern among cannabis cultivators, but the misuse of toxic pesticides comes with its own host of issues. This is where integrated pest management, also known as IPM, comes into play. IPM is a holistic approach to growing and promoting healthy, pest-free crops, which can mitigate the need for pesticides and ensure high-quality, safe cannabis products every time. Today, we will be identifying and exploring how to implement effective IPM strategies and testing procedures in order to prevent loss and produce a healthy, sustainable cannabis crop. We will also highlight the pesticides approved for use in Colorado and in compliance with our regulations. On the panel today, we have Dan Banks. Dan is the founder of Next Generation IPM. He is a horticultural scientist with expertise in cannabis agriculture and integrated pest management. Daniel's couples years of industry experience with a robust education in horticulture and entomology and a lifelong passion for cannabis to apply a unique skill set to cannabis pest management. We're also lucky to have John Scott. John Scott serves as the Pesticide Program Section Chief at the Colorado Department of Agriculture, where he takes the lead in developing policies and regulations regarding pesticide use on marijuana in the state of Colorado. He oversees development of current pesticide use criteria and rules 24C SLN registration criteria, as well as investigation, sampling, and enforcement criteria, policy and procedures. Also, we have Seth Wong, who has 15 years experience running analytical labs. Seth serves as president of TEQ Analytical Lab in Aurora, which offers accurate and reliable scientific data to help growers and manufacturers provide safe and reliable marijuana products to the public in accordance with state laws and regulations. Seth has extensive experience in practical application of wet production laboratory management. And last but not least, we have Scott Hansen. Scott serves as Director of Quality Assurance at Agricor Labs, a state-certified marijuana testing laboratory based in Denver, Colorado, which provides accurate, transparent, and consistent laboratory services for Colorado marijuana cultivators and infused product manufacturers. I just wanted to let you all know that our Q&A period will be after the four panelists conclude their presentations, and then we'll have ample time for questions. I would like to start the discussion off by inviting John Scott to open with his remarks. Thank you, John, and you have the floor.
Great, thank you. Good morning. I'm going to talk a little bit, just kind of give an overview, kind of an evolution of what we've seen as far as in the cannabis industry, as far as with pesticide use, pesticide misuse. A lot of information to cover, so I'll try and move fast. I know I'm on a time. I don't know if we've got a timer going here, but okay. So prior to 2015, when it was just primarily before recreational use went into effect, we would get regular questions from the industry of what could they actually use. And at that point in time, we really didn't have the resources to really delve into and identify what products could be used legally through, again, criteria that we've ultimately developed over the years. We really didn't have those resources to be able to identify products and be able to give guidance to the industry of what products they could use. Our answer essentially at that point in time is, I think with most states, there are no products labeled specifically for use on marijuana. Then in 2012, we had one of our very first complaints. It was a disgruntled employee, and during that investigation, at that point in time, we hadn't even developed as far as our sampling protocols. We weren't even sure how we could handle cannabis at that point in time. And so actually in that investigation, we did everything through admittances. We did, the samples that we did were strictly as far as where the plants were at. We took no plant material at that point in time. And by identifying as far as the residues that we found in the areas where the plants were being held and being treated, and through admittances, we were able to take enforcement action for worker protection standard violations. And then as far as we found Azomax, Avid, and Floramite in those initial investigations. Then in 2015, things really started to shift. What really lit the fuse was I had seen an article in a Denver Fire magazine discussion where Denver Fire Department was talking about all of the pesticides that they were finding in facilities, and we initiated a meeting with Denver Fire Department, Denver Environmental Health, and the city of Denver, and started to have this discussion. And they gave us a list of going, look, these are all the products that we're finding in these facilities that people are telling us that they're using. And we went, well, 99% of them would be illegal to use, and you need to go ahead and forward those over to the department so we can initiate our investigations. And then in March 2015 is when those first formal investigations were initiated. Now, from February 2015, March 2015 through March 2016, during that period of time, we also were working under a governor's directive to establish a list of products that would be legal to use on marijuana. Through that year process, a lot of meetings with the industry, trying to develop exactly what that criteria was. Essentially, we were working only strictly under what the label would allow. And in March 2016, those rules were finally established and finalized, and we were able to develop criteria that set forth how and what products could be used legally on cannabis. And that criteria was that a pesticide product has to have broad label language. And when I say broad label language, we're looking for statements on the label that say things like you can use it on apples and oranges and other crops, or crops such as. So those very broad statements that didn't limit it just to those crops. Now, interestingly enough, that pesticide products that have tolerance requirements have label language that's very locked down. So there are very few products out there that have any of that broad label language. And so primarily, the majority of the products that we identified even prior to the rule were products that were tolerance exempt. Now, additional criteria that we established in rule now is that the product also that can be used would have to have an active ingredient that is tolerance exempt. The label needs to have express food uses. The active ingredient has to have allowed uses on tobacco. And this is all based on known science that we could point to and say that, these are elements of this pesticide product that EPA has already established through the federal registration process. And additionally, 25B products with express food uses, these are minimum risk products. They have to have express food uses on food crops. Through the rule that you can also use products that are approved through the special local need 24C registrations. And then, of course, we built in that we have very broad authority that even if products meet our criteria, if we see that or determine that there's a potential public health risk with the use of that product, we still have the authority to prohibit the use of those products. Now, in November 30th, 2017 of this year, the Pesticide Act is being updated to come in compliance with federal rule, and that is to ensure that 25B products, active ingredient and inert ingredients, are both going to be ensure that those inert ingredients are tolerance exempt as well. So some quick numbers, some things that we've seen since federal year FY15 through 18. These are pesticide misuse investigation numbers. Now these numbers are based on our state fiscal year that run through July through June. Starting in fiscal year 15, of course, we had our first 15 cases that came in after we met with Denver. In 16, you see there are 102 investigations. And then we've seen a trend downward. In fiscal year 17, there was only 27 marijuana investigations. And in 18, so far, we've only had 11. Now, you'll see to the right there, the numbers 56, 52. These are commercial applicator investigations that we have each year. So in the first year, definitely the marijuana investigations outpaced our commercial applicators, and we have, that's on average about the number of commercial applicator investigations we have. Now, marijuana complaints are considered human endangerment cases. They're our highest priority. One of the problems, though, we've had with that is the fact that where we have quickly processed our marijuana investigation cases, you can see on our commercial applicator investigations, those have suffered. We have now some cases that are almost 2 years old because we do not have the staff to be able to work through those cases. So we're trying to address that in the coming year. One note is that 58.6% of all resolved marijuana enforcement cases or complaint cases resulted in some form of enforcement action due to misuse. As far as samples, what did we find? Out of the 599 samples we did in fiscal year 16, 49% of those detected illegal residues. 16% of the samples detected pesticides, but were not a violation. In fiscal year 17, again, we see the trend downward, which is good. We're seeing out of the 570 samples that we took, that only 15% of those were showing detections of illegal pesticides. Well, 45% we did detect pesticides, but those were legal products. Now, in fiscal year 16 and 17, I won't go through all of these, but this does show as far as what compounds we were finding. Myclobutanol tops the list. As I think everybody knows at this point, myclobutanol is certainly a concern since once it's heated, it does turn to hydrogen cyanide. Certainly a health concern, health risk that we have a concern with. Imidacloprid, spiromesiphin, ivermectin. Ivermectin is another product that, of course, is a big concern because it is actually more toxic than strychnine. That a lot of people don't realize that the LD50 is actually more than what strychnine is. And again, other products that we continue to find are on that list. I won't read through all of those, but that's what we've been finding. And again, we've seen a downward trend in fiscal year 17. The other aspect, of course, that always comes up is what we're doing with adulterated products. Now, many of you may know that in the first couple of years, we had Mighty Wash, again, products that are geared towards the industry. Guardian Mite Spray was a 25B that we found abamectin in. This year, in June of 2017, Oregon detected in azetrol, permethrin, bifenthrin, cypermethrin, cyfluthrin, chlorpyrifos, and malathion. We are actually in the process of still trying to run that formulation sample. When we ran into a problem this year due to the number of samples that we're processing in our lab. The equipment that we had to run our formulation samples actually was retooled to deal with sampling, and so we no longer have our equipment to run formulation samples. We're sending those now to the Vermont Department of Ag, and we're waiting for our results on azetrol to determine whether that product's been shipped into the state. And we'll issue a notice on that if that's the case, if we find that product's adulterated. The question always comes up, if I use an adulterated product, is that a violation of the Applicators Act? We always take that into consideration, and we don't consider that a misuse when a product's been adulterated. But the bigger concern for the industry is if it's a product that has a tolerance, it still goes to the med, and they'll have to take action on that. So. As far as future issues, we'll continue to work through with EPA for 24C registrations. Although EPA in June 2017, where we thought this would be an avenue as far as to be able to obtain products that had specific uses for marijuana, EPA denied those registrations from California, Nevada, Vermont, and Washington. Of course, now that MED is looking at allowing research and demonstration, we're hoping that that can continue to move forward as far as the process of gathering information. So once things change in the administration, that we can begin submitting 24C registrations, we'll have that data ready to go. One point I do want to go ahead and touch on before I know I need to wrap up here is we are finding one of the things. somewhat disconcerting, and this was actually one of the industry leaders that we saw an article that he had made the statement that if you're using illegal pesticides and getting caught, you're not using them correctly, meaning that they need to be applied at very low rates so we can't detect them. And what we are finding now in some of our residues, granted we've seen this trend going down that as far as what we're finding levels that are below our level of quantification, and therefore we consider that a non-detect, but we are finding them above the minimum detection limits. So we believe that they're there, but legally we don't feel we're on firm ground that we can take action. But that is very indicative of using pesticides at rates lower than what the label allows to get those residues down below our level of quantification. I will say it's a big concern because this is going to lead to pest resistance to the point that the industry is going to create a situation that with the products that are available or even those products that are illegal, it will not control those pest problems that you'll have in the future. So that is a big concern for the department. One other aspect as far as with MED, continuing with the sampling, as they get the labs up for conducting sampling, it should be noted that there's only 13 products that in your regular compliance sampling that that the MED's going to be looking for. The Department of Ag is going to continue to look for, when we do our residue scans, we scan for over 90 plus products. And any additional products that come to our attention, we will get the methods for and scan for those. And the department will be conducting compliance verification inspections. One of the things that we're switching to is now companies that have been found in violation in the past, we are going back out, we are conducting compliance verification. I'll say in our initial compliance verification inspections, we found those entities to pop positive for pesticide residues, again, for illegal residues. So that's somewhat disconcerting, and hopefully that will not drive the number of cases back up. But when we do find those, we will initiate formal investigations. And then we'll also be conducting sampling during random worker protection standard inspections. And then, of course, all of that information is being, once we do find positive hits, we do communicate that to the Marijuana Enforcement Division and, of course, the health departments. So very quick, that's all. I know I ran over a little bit. Thank you.
Hey everybody, thank you for joining us today and for supporting sustainability in cannabis production. I'm going to be discussing integrated pest management and kind of a high-level overview, and then really honing in on some of the pesticide and testing related issues, kind of setting it up for our speakers that are going to be going more into testing. So, before we get started with it, one of the things that I want to mention is that integrated pest management can be very important for cultivators because not only can it reduce pesticide use, but it can also be the means by which cultivators who have been relying on banned pesticides can have success in pest management when not using those products. Because oftentimes, if we're using banned tolerance exempt pesticides that are stronger chemistries, it's covering up deficiencies in the cultivation process or the facility design that, when addressed, make those products unnecessary. And even in bridging, there are other strategies that can be used beyond those. The other thing is that in the context of sustainability, I think it's important to note that integrated pest management as a philosophy in the US really arose in the late 60s and early 70s. It's kind of an outgrowth of the environmental movement, and in direct response to the overuse of pesticides that led to a lot of environmental damage, but also the development of resistant pests and resurgent of pests that had been suppressed using some of the stronger chemistries. And that if you look at traditional agricultural industries, we kind of see a repeat of this cycle happening. New chemistries come out, they're oversold in terms of efficacy and also having little environmental impact. And then what we find is that the same issues of pest resistance reoccur and environmental damage reoccurs. So integrated pest management is really important in that context as well. So as we're talking about IPM, it's very important to define it. And if you go and Google integrated pest management, you're going to come up with a lot of different definitions that have similar themes. But I think simply put, it's a proactive and multifaceted approach to pest management that's grounded in applied ecology. And when we're talking about ecology, that's the study of organisms and their environment. And the reason we're talking about applied ecology with IPM is that we're very interested in the biology of our crop, the biology and life cycle of the pests and diseases that infest it, and then also how the environment that we create, or in the case of an outdoor cultivation area, the environment that you're subjected to with Mother Nature influences both of those. And so we use that information to identify different strategies for controlling pests beyond just pesticide applications. And we'll talk about those a little bit more, but looking at how you're cultivating your crop, how you might be able to manipulate your environment, and other control strategies that can help you beyond just pesticide applications. The other thing is, in the philosophy of integrated pest management, we recognize that there isn't a silver bullet for any given pest issue. You need to approach things from multiple different avenues and couple different control strategies together. And so that getting away from that silver bullet mentality is really important, especially when stepping away from these banned pesticides. And then before I go into defining the components of an IPM program, I want to mention some cannabis-specific considerations. We're working with a unique crop and unique cultivation environments. Outdoor and greenhouse cultivation facilities are broadly similar to what happens in other agriculture and horticultural industries. But if you look at warehouse-grown cannabis, that's a very unique environment with unique challenges. The other thing is that viable control strategies are going to vary with crop age. And the line there is really vegetative growth versus flowering growth. And it has to do with what's going to be potentially damaging to the crop in terms of control strategies. Also testing what can be used as far as the compliant pesticide and biocontrol and other tools, and how are those going to influence testing at the end. So really thinking about the differences in crop age and what kind of strategies are viable, coupling those two together. But oftentimes you need to have a program for vegetative and then a program for flowering growth, and kind of a bridge between those as plants transition to flowering. The other thing is that when you're looking at traditional integrated pest management, oftentimes the concept of action thresholds don't translate as easily into cannabis. And for brief background, an action threshold in traditional IPM, what we're looking at is what's the cost of controlling a pest versus the potential damage that the pest is going to have on that crop. So we monitor pest levels and then initiate a control once the pest rises above a certain level. In cannabis, because it's such a high value crop, oftentimes we're close to zero as far as our thresholds. So in looking at traditional IPM, you could look at floriculture, where you've got cut flowers and there's very little tolerance for any damage on those. And obviously the products are going to be different because floriculture is a very pesticide-intensive process. But just thinking about that difference in action thresholds. And finally, compliance is key to cannabis cultivation. It's a very highly regulated market. We're going to be getting into testing on the panel a little bit later. You have to have those considerations, whether it be the testing side and also the pesticide use compliance side, in mind when using IPM in cannabis. So looking at the components of an IPM program, the first thing is pest monitoring and identification. And even if you're at the facility build-out level, really understanding what pests and diseases you might be encountering and how to block those out, that identification factor is very important there. But in ongoing integrated pest management, having active scouting, we've got the picture of the sticky cards there as an example of a way to monitor for adult flying insects. But that monitoring and identification aspect is key because you can't effectively control a pest unless you understand what it is and how it works. The second thing, when we get into control strategies, is structural and environmental controls. And those are going to be everything to do with how your facility is built and the infrastructure that you have. So from your HVAC to your humidity control to screening of outside air, and then also compartmentalization of different components in the facility, how all of that is set up. After that, we've got resistant varieties. This is something that I see often overlooked in cannabis cultivation, but looking at the cultivars or strains that you're cultivating and trying to strategically cultivate plants that are more resistant to pests. And this becomes more important if you have an active infestation going on. So what you could do is look at where the pest pressure is at in your facility and potentially look at cloning the plants that are having more problems less, especially while you're trying to get controlled. Because we do see significant differences between varieties in their ability to handle pests and also responses when you're using control tactics. Next, we've got cultural practices, and that's everything to do with how you cultivate your plants, from nutrition to pruning, plant spacing, workflow within the facility. There's a lot of opportunity to modify cultural practices to interrupt specific pests and to also allow for active control strategies to work better. The next category is biological controls, and that's going to be the use of predators and parasitoids of insect and mite pests to actively go after and combat those pests in the facility. And again, those can be coupled with other control strategies. And then the final thing is compliant and responsible pesticide use. And because we're talking about testing and pesticides, we're going to dive into that a little bit further in the coming slides here. But it's important to realize that an IPM approach as a whole, pesticides are just a piece of the puzzle. They're not the entire approach. So with responsible pesticide selection and use, the first thing to do is to understand the different types of pesticides available in your market and how to use them compliantly. So here in Colorado, we have the Department of Agriculture that has done the legwork to really identify what products can be used and not be a violation of state or federal law. And then when going through and looking at that list, it's easy to sort it by active ingredients. So you can look at different active ingredients that are available, and then from there go about actually identifying a brand that you might want to purchase and use. And when doing that, it's really important to thoroughly read the labels, use proper protective equipment, and be aware of worker protection standard and other state regulations and local regulations that might influence pesticide use. So the logo I've got down there is WPS. It's a complex federal standard that has to do with pesticide safe use in agricultural facilities. And we don't have enough time to really dive into that thoroughly here, but the Department of Agriculture is a great resource for understanding that better. And then in terms of actually using pesticides in your facility, rotate modes of action or combine modes of action in tank mixes. And what we're talking about there, the mode of action is the way in which a product kills a pest. So for instance, for horticultural oils or neem oils, things like that, it's going to be smothering. So you're going to actually kill those insects and mites by covering all of their spiracles, which is how they breathe, and suffocating them. Using those along with potentially some other modes of action, so say like azadirachtin, which is an insect growth regulator. There's also pyrethrins, which when responsibly used can be an effective control tool, especially in veg. You can combine those modes, but then rotating other things in as well so that you're not constantly hitting the pest with the same control tool, which can potentially lead to resistance, especially with certain active ingredients. The other big thing there is making sure to couple cultural practices with pesticide applications. So going through and pruning out plants or removing pest damage prior to pesticide applications, looking at your spacing, looking at how you're applying pesticides that are compliant so that you get good contact with pests. And then, it looks like I'm running a little bit. Okay, cool. We got a little bit of time. So the next thing I wanted to talk about is pesticide use in cannabis testing. And really, the goal here is to give you guys a broad understanding of the things to consider and kind of tee it up for Seth and Scott to touch on these issues more. But first off, look at your state's Department of Agriculture, Health, and the Cannabis Enforcement Body for regulations about testing in your state. And the big things to look for in regards to what we're talking about are going to be microbial standards, pesticide residue standards, and then also heavy metal testing standards. And there are things beyond pesticide applications that can influence the testing results. But within what we're talking about right now, even if you're using all compliant pesticides, there are certain state markets that will test for residues of pesticides that are compliantly used. So for instance, in Oregon, they're having a lot of trouble with cultivators failing for pyrethrins, even though pyrethrins are allowed to be used on the list. Another one is pipernyl butoxide. And from a personal standpoint, I would recommend not using pipernyl butoxide at all in your control program because its half-life on plants is very long. It's used as a synergist usually with pyrethrin products. It's also a potential carcinogen, and I think that's one that's going to be regulated more heavily in the future. Pyrethrins, again, a very effective control tool that can be helpful, but if used irresponsibly or at the wrong point in the cultivation cycle, you're going to end up with appreciable residues. And if you're in Oregon, that's going to be a huge problem for you. And that might be something that changes in other state markets. So look at trends. The other thing is microbial testing. There's a lot of biopesticides that can be very effective control tools. And there's also beneficial inoculants that you can use in the root zone. Those can be very effective in an IPM program, but they may also influence your testing at the end, depending on what your state tests for, whether it's total yeast and mold, or if they're also doing bacterial counts. So being aware of the active ingredients in the pesticides you're using, when you're using them in the cultivation cycle, and how that might cause testing issues in the end. And so with that, I'm going to kind of close here and hand it off to Seth. But thank you guys so much for being here and supporting sustainability in cannabis.
All right, good morning. Got it. So I'm going to talk to you about kind of some of the other laboratory aspects of integrated pest management, not necessarily in the sense of laboratory testing, but what other services can a laboratory provide you with that can help you facilitate your pest management program. And so first off, like Dan said, knowing and identifying your pests is part of the problem. Now, it's not just pests that you can see, but we know that we're testing here in Colorado for your yeast and mold content. You're looking for salmonella, you're looking for stec coliforms, but what else is in your facility? And so there's a number of different practices that we can use to help you identify what it is you need to look for, because you need to know how to fight it appropriately. And one of those options is something, an environmental monitoring test, where we can give you, as a laboratory, or you can buy these, in the open market, a sterile sponge or a sterile swab, and you swab and check your facility, send it to your laboratory, they can grow it up and tell you, do you have yeast and mold in your facility? Do you have other types of bacteria? Do you have other pathogens that you need to be concerned about? But this will help you identify what it is potentially in your facility, because the likelihood is, if it's in your facility, it's probably somehow going to make its way to your product, whether that be through human traffic, or maybe you all have push carts that you're moving product around in your process or your facility. And let's say you have a standing pool of water. Well, Listeria loves standing pools of water, and Listeria, as we know, can be pretty nasty if you remember Jensen Farms, and I'll come back to them in a minute. But if you have standing water and it's growing Listeria, and you take your push cart through there, and that push cart then goes all around the rest of your facility to your flowering room, maybe to your product distribution and packaging, and then even into one of the trucks that's going to be distributing product to your dispensary, you potentially just took that Listeria and spread it all around the rest of your facility. Not to mention, you probably had people who crossed paths with that cart. So I don't want to overly scare anybody, but it's important to know what's in your facility and how clean you're keeping it, because there's a lot of things and a lot of factors that can be occurring that you don't necessarily know are there. And so you want to be able to know and identify all those, and through environmental monitoring, we can help you identify what else is in your facility that you don't know about. Maybe you moved into a facility and started using an HVAC, or actually this is a great time of year, it's winter, right? A lot of people haven't turned on their heaters yet. So heaters have been hanging out for a couple months. There could be yeast and mold spores on them from environmental contamination just through outside air. You could have other forms of bacteria. Maybe, somehow a bird got into your facility, you've taken care of the bird, but they left some droppings behind, and birds are notoriously known to carry salmonella, and you can have that all on your heating coil. Once you fire up that furnace, it's going to spread that through the air current into the rest of your facility. So it's important that you monitor and keep track of everything that's happening in your facility, and you know how clean it is, because you don't want those unknowns that are going to emerge later and pose to be a threat to your business. In the case of Jensen Farms, if you recall, they did Listeria, or they had Listeria in their cantaloupe. They didn't have natural contamination from the farm. They had purchased a piece of processing equipment from a potato facility, brought it into their manufacturing process, and that was found to be the origin of their Listeria, which then got contaminated on everything else. So the Jensen Farm guys may have been doing things appropriately in certain instances, but even something as simple as introducing a new piece of equipment that you bought used because you're trying to save money, you want to make sure that you've considered all the different facts and unknowns, and you know about that instrumentation or that mechanical equipment to the best of your ability, so it doesn't sneak up on you later. So what kind of practices, operations, and procedures do you have in the facility? How often are you cleaning? Are you rotating your cleaners? Dan mentioned that we can develop some resistance to particular to pesticides. Well, that can also happen with cleaners. You want to make sure that you're not going to use a cleaner and have a microbial develop a tolerance to that and then become more virulent and more difficult to remediate later. So through facilities control process and monitoring and laboratory testing, we can help you with sponges, swabs, understanding your facility, understanding the traffic patterns, and making sure you're starting with a clean facility so that you're minimizing as much of your risk as possible, in addition to not just testing your plant products or your concentrates or your edibles. So it's always good because we know what we know and we know what we don't know, right? Or that's really dangerous because we know we're looking for STEC, which is a form of coliforms. We know we're looking for salmonella, but what aren't we looking for? If you have human processing in your plant, the likelihood of staph could be pretty high. Staph occurs naturally within mucous membranes in humans, so it's growing probably in your nose somewhere. Now, for all of us in here, we're probably healthy enough that it's not an issue, but if you're providing products to a medically needed population or somebody who's got an immunocompromised scenario, and you have somebody on the line who's just got an itch in their nose and they take their glove and they kind of rub around and then they go back to hand processing, they may have created a staph contamination in your process. So knowing and understanding what we're looking for aside from what's just required are also just as important. But it's also important to understand what are the risk profiles of all the activities that you have within your facility and how are you mitigating them to the best of your ability. Contaminants can really come from many sources, like I talked about. Bringing in new equipment that you just purchased, the individuals who are processing on the line, and then even if you have guests and visitors throughout your facilities, I know a lot of people, particularly in grows, make people put on booties and gown up, but this can also have an impact on your concentrate processing facility or even your edibles manufacturer facility. You don't know where they came from, you don't know where they were before you. You want to make sure that there's a common set of criteria before they come into your facility that they're following so you can ensure all of the precautions you're taking ahead of time to ensure a clean facility are being maintained throughout the entire process. Because truly what we don't know can't hurt us. In the case of Jack in the Box, years ago when they had their first E. coli outbreak that unfortunately resulted in a number of deaths, we didn't know to look for E. coli then. We knew that 0157H7 E. coli was prominent in beef, but we never thought it would be a factor. And now it's a regulatory requirement that all ground beef manufacturers are testing on a regular basis because this particular strain of E. coli is so virulent and so dangerous that it can really, decimate people, and that's why we, in our business, even have the STEC testing requirement. Because it's not just 0157, that's a form of STEC. It's also other forms of E. coli, 0126, 01111. We can have a microbiology epidemiology class later, and maybe Scott will teach it. But so there's a lot of stuff we don't know, and what we don't know can hurt us, especially because it may be there. We just need to prove that it's not. So what's the cleaning and sanitation facility requirement? How often are you rotating cleaners? Are you monitoring the active ingredients? Are you ensuring that your environmental monitoring is clean? And it doesn't always mean that it's going to be clean. You may have a threshold where there's an appropriate level of a positive level of activity within certain less virulent or toxic microbiological organisms, but are you tracking that data and then are you keeping it controlled? Food facilities normally have listeria. They're just prominent for listeria. No matter what you try to do, no matter how many times you try to clean, it just lives in the drains. And so are you ensuring that you're testing and monitoring regularly and making sure that those drains are staying at bay and whatever cleaning practice you have is keeping that listeria contained? You may not be able to eradicate it aside from demolitioning your entire building and starting fresh, but the point is, are you checking to make sure that you've got the population or the problem population controlled? And then what type of listeria are you working with? But we'll get into that part more later. So as I mentioned, we can't just analyze what's on the walls or what's in the facility or on the floor, but we can also look at the air. So do you have a blower or an HVAC process that seems to be particularly problematic? And we can put air plates around your facility to monitor where we think we have increases of yeast and mold. You may see this with certain plants that always tend to have a high yeast and mold count. Some of that may be applicable to the strain that you're particularly growing. What's the water activity available to grow microbials? What's the bud density? But also, maybe it's in a bad spot in your facility where you just have an open door right next to that plant, and everybody coming through seems to leave something behind when they go by. And so, what is happening in the air? What's happening in the nooks and crannies of all your facilities and the drains? And then is your water that you're using in the facility clean to start with? We don't know, and we haven't really done a lot of studies as an industry to tell you if we're having absorption through the root structure of E. coli into the plant tissue yet. And that may be a ways out, but you can at least check your water supply now to ensure that your coliforms are clear and that you're using clean water to begin with. And then what other organisms are you using in the process to kind of tell you generally how you're cleaning? you may not be, yeast and mold only looks for yeast and mold spores, but there's other types of testing that we can offer, generic E. coli screens and general bacterial counts that'll tell you, are you doing a good job of keeping your facility clean? Because if those counts are low, you're probably maintaining a good environment, and hopefully they're non-existent. But we know an absolute zero is not always possible. If those numbers are creeping up on you, what does that mean? And then are you tracking them throughout the year? Because there may be seasons where numbers are going to be higher, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It just means you need to increase your cleaning regimen. So how are we using the data we have, and how are you effectively monitoring your facilities to ensure that your product, which you're so carefully protecting right now, is going to be clean in the end? So with that, I'll let Scott get into the nitty-gritty of all the intricacies of laboratory testing.
Good morning. So how many people like yeast and mold or bacterial contamination on their products? No one?
If it's lactobacillus, I don't mind it.
All right, you've had your time to talk, enough of you. On that same vein, how many people would like to buy products, whether they're food or cannabis, that are laden with pesticides? No one, I presume, otherwise we wouldn't be here, right? So I want to echo what a lot of the other panelists have said, including Seth. You've got to start clean and you've got to stay clean. That's really the best pest management. That's the way to avoid using pesticides. That's your best path forward. I think I see at a lot of these conferences technologies that are, marketed to the cannabis industry to say, you can wave this magic wand that NASA designed and it's going to clean everything off. That works in an already clean, immaculate space capsule. In a dirty grow operation or where soils and plants are active, that's not your best strategy. Your best strategy is to start clean, to stay clean, to work out your cleaning regimen, to understand your environmental background through environmental monitoring, and that's where laboratory services can come and help with that. But I'll get into the nitty-gritty of what we do and how that's important to you as far as pesticide analysis and things like that. Method validation is critical. The state health department and the MED and the CDA and other participating labs went through a series of method and instrument validation tests to determine what the limits were, the capabilities of the laboratories, capabilities of the instruments, to understand how low we can see these results, to measure residual backgrounds. I think it was John that said what we're trying to measure is not a residue limit of what you're using for illegal pesticides. You're not supposed to use illegal pesticides. They're not supposed to be there. So really, we shouldn't be finding anything if people are compliant and upholding the law. Another critical thing with selection and instruments and the science of things is I come from a background of pharmaceuticals, and if you're looking for contaminants in clean drugs, those are easy to find. If you're looking for contaminants in a plant-based medicine that has 1,000 compounds, it's really difficult. So if you use, say, spinach to say, can I see 200 pesticides, that might be easy. If you use cannabis to see those same 200 pesticides with 100 terpenes, 100 cannabinoids, and a number of phytochemicals, that's going to be a lot more difficult, especially to quantify and identify consistently that you see these problem compounds. So we use a lot of quality control processes and procedures to make sure we use certified standards to understand that the stuff that we see in your product or try not to see in your product, that we confirm that that's true. And some of that method validation is instrument specific too. Again, these products are so difficult to see these low-level pesticides, or hopefully nothing, that we use pretty high-end instruments that need to be cleaned and maintained and taken care of. They have low sensitivities. They can see these things down to really low levels. So we have to take good care in our quality procedures, but also in our cleaning procedures to make sure that the lab isn't misidentifying something for industry. One of those ways that we can do that is state licensing and certifications. ISO is another part of that that's starting to come online. You see the rulemaking bodies in California are driving labs to start with that. Colorado is evolving into that standard, I think. It's been proposed a few times. Our laboratory and CEST laboratory and a few others in the state have that already. It's just kind of another quality standard to say, can your lab meet some of these things? Can they prove that with documentation? It's a way for you to select services that you're confident in, and that's what it comes to on the laboratory side, is you need to be confident in the people that are giving you these numbers, whether it's an environmental background to understand your environmental load, or whether it's the pesticide testing that's going on to look for these contaminants. So what pesticides are we concerned about? I think John alluded to the fact that there are 13 that the MED is looking at right now. The concern with that, obviously, is if someone wants to use pesticides, they just go to the 14th pesticide that's on that list, and now nobody's going to see it, except for the CDA. But obviously, that's not where you want to go. You want to keep these operations clean. You got to. I think it was one of the earlier speakers that talked about people. They talked about the employees. They talked about the consumers. They talked about the medical patients. All this work that we're talking about here, sustainability, minimizing chemical use, controlling clean products, this is all for people. It's your people, it's you, it's your family member that's going to use your product, it's a consumer. Regardless of their desired use, they deserve clean products, and we deserve to give that to them. So while we don't have the sexiest topic to talk about up here, we are kind of the gatekeepers to that. We are the people, I think, again, it was a previous speaker that talked about all these certifications that are coming online. The backbone of these certifications is laboratory data to prove that when someone says they don't use pesticides, I think it was one of the speakers from Oregon, nobody used pesticides, admittedly, when they said they were all organic, and then they popped hot for some of these pesticides. It's our job as laboratories to hold people accountable for these things. And so we take that job very seriously. Another challenge that we have, aside from the chemical entities in cannabis itself, are the varied and numerous types of products that people in the industry are so creatively putting these into, whether those are edibles or topicals, or our laboratory has seen everything from dog treats to beef jerky to, I mean, you name it. So you have to make sure that your method and your instrumentation is capable of pulling that out and looking for that as well. So that's something it's rooted in sound science to make sure that the procedures that you use are applicable to the product, but also to the product types. There's a lot of R&D work going on right now. I think someone else mentioned it also. The state of Colorado passed a bill allowing for research, and one of those allowances was for pesticides. Again, I'll reiterate the fact that if you can get away from using that at all, and I think that Dan mentioned that as well, if you can keep your environment clean and minimize usage at all, that's important. But I think there's going to be a point where we have some pesticides that are approved for use, and that'll come out through the research bills. So that's something to think about in the future. Here's a list of pesticides of those 13 that I mentioned before that the state's going to be monitoring, and their associated limits. These limits fall somewhere between the higher limits that are nationally and the lower limits. This isn't the capability, but the state kind of arrived at these limits taking the tact that it's not just that we can see them down to the detection limit that John mentioned, it's can we consistently see them, because we want to avoid frightening public and litigating this stuff and pulling products away from the industry if we don't see these things reliably. So it comes down to positive identification and confirmation that we can actually see these. We'd like to see these at lower levels. Actually, we'd like to see them, absent at all. But this is a good starting point. This is the first round of Colorado's attempt at getting a picture of what's going on in the industry. So these limits are higher than I think the Department of Ag would like to see, and higher than should be on the plants. But this is something that I think we can consistently look at without popping false positives and frightening the industry and that kind of stuff. I think that's about all I have. I think what I talked about before was we're a key piece to the puzzle, the pesticide testing and the environmental monitoring. We're key to the I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought. I think that's all I have.
Okay, I want to thank all of you on the panel. And now this is my favorite part of any panel presentation, which is the question and answer. I think this is where you really In my mind, there's no such thing as a dumb question. Every question helps inform a better understanding not only of the person who asked the question, but also of the respondent. Sometimes you're asked a question, you just haven't thought about something in a certain way. So again, this is my favorite part of it. So if you have questions, we have microphones on either side of the room. If you come up and ask there, I'm losing my train of thought.
So I think it was John that mentioned the Guardian, and I feel like a lot of growers here in Colorado were deceived by that company. So is there a product that is organic that we can use on russet mites and spider mites that you guys would endorse, so that you guys see that are effective, so that we don't have to buy into a company and then find out we're doing it wrong?
You know, the department we don't endorse any specific product. And we realize that all products, especially those minimum risk, can have varying levels of effectiveness. As you know, when we do our registration, we just verify that the claims that are being made on the label are valid and meet the research that they've submitted to us for the registration to ensure that it's not misbranded. Now, in the situation with Guardian, that was clearly a situation where that company had adulterated their product. Of course, we helped in the investigation on that with EPA and provided them information. And granted, that company I know has federal prosecution for adulterating those products. And, you know, that is one of the things I will say that through the State FIFRA Issues Research Evaluation Group, it's a group SFI-REG, it's a part of our National Association's working group, that, you know, we've really pushed EPA that 25B products, again, under the federal registration process, criteria, they're exempt from a lot of the federal requirements for pesticide registration because they are minimum risk. But you know, this has certainly brought it to state's attention and to EPA's attention, and we're pushing that more needs to be done to regulate those entities with that are claiming minimum risk to ensure that we don't have those types of problems pop up with Guardian. And you know, right now it's a matter of states really taking upon themselves to do those formulation samples for us to be able to identify them and then turn them over to EPA. So,
I'd just like to jump in there with John. And when you're looking at EPA registered products, it can be really important to think in terms of active ingredients. So some good active ingredients that can help with russet mites: clarified hydrophobic extract of neem, mineral oils, and then also potassium salts of fatty acids. And there's a variety of products on the Colorado list that have those active ingredients and can be useful tools. On the 25B side, what John said is very true. There is no, it's kind of like the health food supplement market. They make a claim and there's no proactive enforcement on what's actually in that bottle. If there is some sort of a test that pops positive or something like with Guardian Mite, then retroactively that company can get in trouble. But at that point, the cultivator has already been damaged, the end user has already been damaged. So if you are going to use 25B products, I would look at bigger ag manufacturers that have been in the game longer. So two that have some good products are JH Biotech. Also, Brandt has some good things. And there's some other, Brandt. Yeah, and there's some good, like for instance, on the JH Biotech side, two that they've got are GC Mite, which is a good product for broad insect and mite control. There's also Mildew Cure, which I believe here in the state actually is registered under their Safer Grow brand, but that's a good one for powdery mildew. And those are some decent 25B products that I've seen some effectiveness with. But just be careful with 25Bs because some of the claims may not be backed up, and you could also potentially have some off-label stuff in there. So, good question. Thank you.
What was the first one you said?
JH Biotech was the yeah. JH Biotech was the company. Yeah.
I know we've got more questions.
Med 52, why is that not legal in the new stuff that's coming out, like the Tanagar and stuff like that? Why it has like the same thing, I believe, in it? So why is Med 52 not approved by the state?
The question was, why is Met 52? That, first of all, if it was removed from the list, We had, I want to say, 75 some odd products that did not meet the criteria that when the rule went into effect, that were removed from the list. So if it's not currently on the list or was removed, more than likely there's one element of that criteria that it no longer met. So either it didn't have express food uses, or it didn't have uses on tobacco. We found several, there were a lot of products that came off the list because the active ingredient had never been approved for use on tobacco. So therefore we know that either pyrolysis studies or EPA never made that determination that it would be safe for use on tobacco. So that would more than likely be the reason why.
Okay, the gentleman over there, and then you.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm curious, I understand how the Department of Ag or any legal organization doesn't want to take on the liability for endorsing certain products. I'm wondering if you know of any like open source sites basically where in the cannabis community, because it's very common, I think, in our industry when somebody finds something that works that they want to try and like keep it to themselves to get a leg up. And I'm just wondering if there's anything out there that you've come across that shows like people sharing knowledge, creating a learning environment that said, hey, I use this, I'm in Oregon, and then somebody in Colorado can pick it up and try using it. So more of like a sharing environment, whether it's online or through organizations. Thanks.
I'll say, as far as, I mean, we spent a lot of time, we laugh about that now because, years ago, God, if we were ever to do a search for marijuana or cannabis on our state computers, we would have lost our jobs over it. But now, that is one of our, a regular process that we're always looking for information online to see what people are saying. I guess to your point, we don't endorse or know of a specific site where that information is shared, and maybe these gentlemen do. But I know I see a lot of blogs where people are making statements as far as what products are working for them, which products are not. Of course, in some cases, we see a lot of recommendations that aren't necessarily legal in those situations as well. But honestly, that's kind of where we see those types of recommendations or that type of the community sharing information.
I guess one thing that I would add to that is that there doesn't seem to be what you're looking for yet, but if you're looking to kind of understand your pest that you're dealing with and maybe some control strategies, I would say go to University Extension and look for publications that have been put out for organic agriculture and kind of how to combat similar pests or the same pests in different crops, and then run those recommendations through the filter of what you understand being a cannabis cultivator, and then also looking at other sources. But going to Extension, at least in terms of pest identification and control, is I think going to be a better bet than the forums in a lot of cases.
I haven't personally seen a lot of sharing in an online form of that regard, and to your point, I think people are hoarding intellectual property for the sake of branching out, but I do know from talking to a number of grow suppliers, companies like Way to Grow and whatnot, seem to collect a lot of that information just because they're providing products, so that may be an interesting place to start.
And I think the research bill that I talked about, I know there are pesticide manufacturers that want to come in and do some of that research to offer products to the cannabis industry, so hopefully that'll be publicized because it's in their better interest to sell it to you. And then hopefully it'll be scientifically valid in that case.
Yes, sir.
Hi, hello. I'm Mark Sprout from the city of Berkeley. I just want to point out we've been testing since 2014 in that jurisdiction of California, and still are. So we were the first there to do it. Some of my growers, some of the feedback that I got was that they're getting hit with myclobutanil a lot, and these are organic guys. They'd never put it on there and stuff. And so kind of looking at that, it appears that, we grow a lot of grapes, and myclobutanil is used on grape crops. Well, it persists in the soil, in the compost, so the plants are actually bringing it up from the soil they're using. So you mentioned the environment and testing the environment, the water, the walls. How about, are people testing their soil at all?
We've not seen that, and that's interesting information because you have a lot bigger data set than we have. I think that would be something to drive to.
It's something you might want to look at, and if there's heavy metals in the soil, the plants are going to take those up.
Well, that was something I was going to mention when somebody was talking about different additives. I spent 2 years working with a hemp company that that made medicine for children, essentially. And we even found one of our soil additives had an allowable limit of lead that would never have met the California regulations, and we were dumping it on our plant material. So it's something you have to consider. You have to look at the entire supply chain and everything that touches your plant from soil on.
Thank you very much.
Are you talking Prop 65?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Amy Garver. I'm a co-founder of a company called Hazel Technologies, and we believe in sustainable chemistry to develop biopesticides in addition to organic biopesticides. So I just wanted to say that it's not just big companies that you can rely on to develop products. We currently have products in the market for extending the shelf life of produce, specifically to mitigate food waste, as 40% of food is wasted from harvest to table. But we're certainly interested in engaging with the cannabis community in developing products that are needed for either pre or post harvest. So if you want to go to hazeltechnologies.com and engage with us on a conversation on what is needed. We are certainly willing to develop in this area. We're a really small startup, and I know that the cannabis industry is also startup friendly, so we can engage in this conversation together. With regard to the 24C special local need approvals, particularly relating to the research and development arm of that, what research and development is justifiable for a special local need registration?
Your question is what research and development is justifiable for a 24C? Ultimately, a couple aspects with 24Cs. One, obviously we need to get EPA back to the table where they are open to submissions of 24C applications from the states. Now, as far as future research and development, I think where we're really going to see the initial push that Scott's with their subsidiary company General Hydroponics, the initial push that they did with the 24Cs were products that were already tolerance exempt, and so there wasn't a lot of research necessarily that was needed. They were able to bridge data. Because it was already established that the product was tolerance exempt, worker protection standards have been taken into consideration, and so they were really looking at developing specific directions for use on cannabis, how those products could be most effective. But I think what we're looking at as far as for future research and development is really going to be establishing what are safe levels on cannabis. There are so many unknowns as far as how the plant processes, how it breaks down those residues, not to mention all of the ways in which cannabis is being consumed, especially what residues are safe on the plant then with the expectation that it will be extracted, and then what's going to be those levels that would be safe in those extracts. So I think there's going to have to be a lot of research conducted to determine what would be safe residues for this particular crop and all the ways in which it's ingested. And then, of course, the big outlier out there that there is no data at all for is consumption levels. And all the manners in which marijuana is consumed, at what amounts, the consideration for people that are medically compromised, and those elements that need to be taken into consideration. So, I think that really opens up. There's so much research that needs to be done to be able to establish what are the residue levels that will ultimately be safe for those products that require tolerances.
Thank you.
So, John, how would the industry submit possible pesticide alternatives?
Well, as far as if there are existing products that aren't on our list, it's just a matter of contacting the department, saying that XYZ product is a product we'd like to use. Would you review it? And we regularly, every month, we get 2 or 3 requests. We'll review those products. If it meets the criteria, we'll add it to the list immediately.
Okay.
Are you currently studying anybody that's using actively aerated compost teas and just building up a biofilm and not really having to worry about a lot of the problems that the other hydroponic growers are facing?
I'm not aware of that off the top of my head, so that very well could be, as far as on how they're developing their
Are you
practices.
guys open to researching that, on using compost teas to spray on a foiler, as a foiler feed, and then using that as your pesticide?
Again, I mean, we regulate pesticide use, so if it's the development of a compost, and if the compost would have pesticidal properties, that then ultimately would, and maybe, and hopefully I'm getting your question correct. So if a company is developing some sort of compost with a pesticidal property, that would be no different than any other pesticide product that would have to go through the federal registration process if it's making pesticidal claims.
Like, all right, so if I improve the quality of my product, right, I'm improving the calcium, so I'm actually improving the pectin content within the sap of the sugars of the cannabis plant. That's been known on Dutch farmers to prevent powdery mildew, to prevent a lot of these pesticide problems.
Well, I think, so two different aspects here. If you're developing methods to grow your crop through better nutrient processes that make it less susceptible to a pest problem, we don't regulate that. However, if you are developing some form of compost that you're saying, this compost will has pesticidal properties that will prevent or mitigate, it all depends on what your claims are. So we've seen this in situations where people say, I'm going to put this on your lawn and it'll prevent dandelions. That's a pesticidal claim that requires regulation. If they say, I'm going to put this fertilizer on your lawn, it'll make it healthier and it'll make it harder for dandelions to establish, that's not a pesticidal claim. Is that, the difference in that? So I think that's to your point of on your growing practices, if you're growing healthier through nutrient supplementation and makes your plants healthier so they're less susceptible, that's not something we would regulate.
So as long as we don't make the claim and just the customer sees it for themselves, we're good to go, spraying compost tea?
I would say, let's talk specifically what your there's always semantics to every situation, but generally if you're saying, yeah, I grow a healthier plant, and so we don't have pest problems because the methods that we grow, I don't see that as a pesticidal claim.
So here's a continuation of that question. Where's the regulatory line if this gentleman is doing this in his own grow, but not marketing this outside of that, and he's applying it to his own crops, but he's not selling that or making those claims? Where does the regulatory line exist?
So clarify that question.
So if you're applying this technique to only your own grow operation, but you are not selling this formula to other growers with claims or without, you're just using it as a practice for your own grow, would that be something that would be in the regulatory crosshairs for Department of Ag?
Yes, there is a fine line in the aspect of if you are making claims and you are distributing that product, that crosses a line into distribution. If you're making claims, pesticidal claims that require registration. We run into situations where people at their home grows they mix up, Coca-Cola, tobacco juice, and soap, and they're applying that to their plants. We don't regulate that. Is it a pesticide? Absolutely. It crosses the line when they put it into a bottle and sell it to their neighbor. Then they're distributing it, then it's a pesticide that's regulated, it has to be labeled, registered federally. So, but.
You better put a lawyer on the pesticide panel next year.
Yeah.
Making it up.
John, with your example that you just gave, would that cross the line if they were a commercial cultivator that was doing that?
Yes. Now, if a commercial cultivator, that's one of the things in our rule requires that growers growing commercially can only use registered pesticides. So if you're making your own home brew, and the reason why we put that provision in our law was that you have to use registered pesticides, because one of the things that we heard in our committees at the very beginning of the discussions was we had some growers that said, I'll just buy technical grade imidacloprid from China and I'll just make my own pesticide. And we went, no, that's not going to work. It has to be a registered pesticide. But that is correct. So if you were even taking soap and water, Coca-Cola and tobacco juice and spraying it to your commercial crop, that would be a violation of the Applicators Act.
And for you guys, the only thing I would add on the aerated compost tea side is be careful with the microbial regulations in your state and how that might influence it, because depending on the organisms that are in your tea, even if they may be potentially benign, so not harmful to people, not harmful to the plant, if you're just looking at these state tests, oftentimes we're looking at total yeast and mold loads, like here in Colorado. There's other states that look at total bacterial. So depending on when that is used and how it's used, you may cause yourself to fail a microbial test. And so that's, another consideration with that.
Okay, I've got a lab question for Scott and Seth. So what are the important considerations that you need to take into account when you are looking for a lab? How should you be evaluating it?
You want me to start and then you want to jump in?
Yep.
Okay. Or do you want to start?
You can start.
Okay. So I think first off is certainly transparency of information. So are they willing to release the data packet to you that's related to the analysis that was generated with your samples? There's ways to release portions of that data that can be essentially redacted or released in a manner so that it doesn't give away their intellectual property, but you want to be able to look at and know that they're clearly separating out the analytes of interest from other products, and that you can have a clear distinction that what they're really looking for is what they're recovering. Now, this goes all the way down through essentially an entire audit. You don't want to just look at the data, you want to audit your laboratory. You want to know what quality control procedures they have in place, how do they ensure your sample's not getting mixed up right when you bring it in, and that it was your sample that was truly analyzed. What quality control parameters do they have in place when you're doing the analysis? So how many points on the calibration curve do they have for instrumentation to ensure good linear regression, which means this test or the analysis is scientifically valid? Plus, do they have bleed over from other samples that could be cross-contaminating yours? Have they done a method extraction verification or validation to prove that when they're extracting cannabinoids out of your product, they're only getting cannabinoids. They're not getting other products that may inflate your cannabinoid values and or depress them, because they may be leaving some behind. And we know that in the extraction process, flowers differ from concentrates differ than edibles. So there should be a matrix validation on every different type of product that you're taking in that'll prove that they're only pulling out the analytes of interest and not giving you incorrect results. But then you also want to make sure that their validation data has also been proven, that the method works overall, and that they're actually recovering the analytes of interest. So there's a whole number of components that you're looking at through the entire process, and there's, like Scott mentioned, certified reference materials and analyzing those in relation, but you want to basically do an audit of your laboratory, and if you don't have a scientific staff member within your individual workforce, people are easily available to provide these services, but your lab also should be able to take you through it and explain it to you, and it should relatively make sense. I mean, that's our job, is to take this information and disseminate it out and not provide you all of these extra kind of confusing processes, but we know it can be a convoluted process. And so I would recommend auditing your laboratory, looking for the QC processes, verifying that they're looking for the analytes only and that's what they're actually seeing, and that seems to kind of all make sense from what you're looking at, but I know that that's a relatively convoluted statement when you're talking about science anyways, because they're explaining it to you, but what else?
So I agree with everything that Seth said. Unfortunately, and this is my opinion, the certification that the state puts labs under is inadequate to do all the things that Seth just mentioned. So if you're selecting a laboratory based on it's certified with the state, and I'm only speaking about Colorado, I don't have enough experience with other states, I don't think that's enough, which is why labs like ours have sought the ISO certification standard and things like that. I agree with Seth. If you want to audit your lab, they're doing work for you, they should be transparent in that. If they say, no, we don't do that, my first experience with a lab that's no longer in business as a director of quality for another company, I said, I'm here to audit your lab, and they said, only the state gets to do that. That's the wrong answer. I mean, transparency is key. It's your data, it's your information. The other thing I'll say, to building on everything that Seth said, is the entire end goal is an accurate result so that you know exactly what's in the product, whether you're the consumer or the producer. But ultimately, it's also the job that the lab does in meeting all these checklists that Seth just mentioned is defensibility. And I think that's where pesticides is really going to be front and center. I like to tell our customers that the main people that are going to make the boatload of money in cannabis in the next 10 years are attorneys. This stuff's going to get litigated, right? So if you don't have a solid laboratory with solitary quality control practices, all great records, you're not going to have defendability. And if you make a customer sick, or someone that you're supplying products to say that you did this and you don't have proof of that, our data that we generate as laboratories is your proof. And the quality systems behind that are what will hold up to defensibility, whether that's litigation or your own personal audit. So.
Thank you. And the last question, unless there are more from the audience, is from me. So what percentage of the industry is adopting IPM practices? If you could ballpark it, Dan. And if you want to pursue IPM as a strategy, what would your first steps be?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to start with the second question first.
Okay.
I think that the biggest thing to do to start with is identify the pests that you're seeking to control, whether that's something that's currently in your facility or whether it's, say a new build and you're trying to look at what might be coming in and what you're trying to block. But knowing what your enemy is absolutely crucial to devising effective control strategies. And then all of the other components that we discussed earlier kind of go into that. But you have to view it through the lens of what that pest or pathogen is and how you can best control it by utilizing the different strategies. And then in terms of what portion of the industry, it's tough because we don't have solid numbers on that. I have seen a huge uptick in interest, and I think that a lot of cultivators are starting to become more aware of how IPM works in the different facets. And so I would say that at this point in Colorado, with the bans that we've had on some of the tolerance requiring pesticides and with the changes, that to a certain extent, I think, many cultivators are at least starting to view things through a similar lens and realizing that there's more components than just pesticide sprays to pest control. But in terms of formal adoption of IPM, to be completely honest, I'm not sure where we are at as an industry right now.
Do you see any differences between the different types of grows, between indoor, greenhouse, or outdoor, as far as adoption of IPM?
I would say that tough to say really, on the greenhouse and outdoor side, typically if there is somebody involved in the cultivation operations that has a horticulture degree or some sort of background in crop production, then they're going to have more of an awareness of that. And so you may see that a little bit more in those, but it really depends on the cultivator.
Great. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Are there any other questions from the audience? Hearing none, I want to thank you very much for participating in our second annual Cannabis Sustainability Symposium. I hope you enjoyed it, and we look forward to seeing you again next year. Thank you.